Welcome to Season 2 and Episode 26 of the Bishop on a Bike podcast. Today, our guest is Rebecca Anderson. Rebecca's a storyteller, a comedian, a playwright, a preacher. She's been on the radio, she's been live, she's taught at a Jewish school, she's done a lot of really cool stuff. We had her as our convocation speaker this past fall here in the New England Synod, and I was so impressed with her work and her ministry that had to get her on the podcast. So she's our guest today. As always, this podcast is brought to you by the good folks at the ELCA Mission Investment Fund. So we thank them for their sponsorship. I sat down with Rebecca via Skype, and we had a conversation about comedy, about storytelling, and about ways in which congregations and churches and preachers can embrace storytelling and use it as a tool for good ministry in their congregations. I think you'll enjoy this conversation with Rebecca Anderson as we launch into Season 2 of the Bishop on a Bike podcast.
So I was working at this school, and I was doing stand-up comedy. And I experienced among the comics just a community with people that I really enjoyed and admired, who thought pretty hard about things, who were careful about their craft, and who respected mine, even though I was like brand new and would talk with me about stuff that I was doing. And of course, in some ways, just really practically speaking, it feels churchy. There's a group of people listening to some other people up front. And those people have done some thought and preparation in order to make something happen together in a room. But in terms of how serious the church has been, I think after all of like the big great sins, like systemic racism and misogyny and violence and all of the big sins of the church historically, that over earnestness has really like sucked the joy out of the gospel. At the New Storytelling Church, we talk about good news that feels like good news. My co-pastor preached a sermon this summer that was like, you know, what kind of good news is it that starts with like, okay, I have good news for you. But first back up, you were born evil, evil babies. Like that's where the good news starts. You're like, this doesn't feel great. Like it doesn't feel like awesome news. And so we talk about good news that feels like good news, and that laughing together is one of the ways that we feel that, or that we practice knowing that. I don't think like comedy and humor, it's not quite the same for me as joy, but it is a way of kind of creating space for the possibility of joy or of change, or, you know, laughter creates space in my experience.
So how did you connect to church and Jesus again? Because it sounds like maybe there was something in your roots, your childhood, and then you abandoned it, and then came back to it. Make that connection for me. I didn't quite.
Yeah, I didn't abandon it hard. I did the kind of sideways slide that a lot of people do in college. I was raised in an kind of lowercase e evangelical church, and I loved church. My dad was is a pastor. I loved. I liked church. I liked singing and sermons and communion and potluck. So I liked the shape of church, community. But kind of as soon as I got to junior high, I couldn't make the theology hang together for me. And the way I think about it now is that there was like an inconsistency between talking about an all-loving God who would consign people to eternal suffering, or an all-powerful God who had God's hands tied if you didn't pray the sinner's prayer. And you know, fundamentalism being what it is, if you don't check off all the boxes, then you're not a Christian. And so I just thought, well, I understood that. And I thought with some sadness, I guess I'm not a Christian. And in retrospect, it took me so long to realize like that there are other kinds of churches, and that if I had grown up in those churches, I would have had a different experience. So I just kind of slid sideways away from it when I got to college. And I, you know, had like a pretty decent life without it. I dipped my toes in a couple of different religious communities, but it was working in this Jewish school, being part of a community of practice, and it was one of the things that reminded me how valuable it had been. And so I was doing was living in Boston doing these things, and a non-religious friend who I had met at a summer camp in Vermont said that if she were someone like me, she would check out this church that she had heard about, and she had all the details wrong, the wrong neighborhood, wrong pastor, wrong everything. And it turned out it was a new church, a UCC and Disciples Church, like a half mile from my house in Boston. And I kind of like fell in there, and like a lot of people, it took me about 3 months of wanting to go to actually go. And I was in. I was like right away. And I talk about it now with the kind of embarrassment that, like, if you ever meet people who got together, like dated each other and then got engaged like 3 weeks later, and they're sort of sheepish about it.
Right.
But they're like, well, but it worked. I mean, we've been together 10 years.
Right.
It's working out, it's that kind of embarrassment where I like went back to church and was like, like this, an all loving God. And so we practice love and a hospitable God. And so we practice welcome, and people who had a very high Christology and were very progressive, which was not something I had seen a lot of at that point. Very creative, very beautiful, sort of voice forward, like vocal music was super important. The proclamation of the word, weekly communion, which I hadn't experienced coming from like a low Protestant tradition. Things that I know now exist in lots of places, but so I walked in those doors and was like, very shortly after, like in the choir and leading prayers, and then had this very small moment of watching my preacher do her thing, and thought like, oh, this is what my skill set is, and
I can do this.
Yeah.
I can do this.
Like egocentric call where I was like,
well, you need a little ego to do this work. So here's here's something that I've noticed that you and a number of other people that came out of more rigid forms of Christianity. I never know how to categorize the whole group, because whatever, big E, evangelical, fundamentalist, whatever. There's a number of people that were raised in that tradition, and left it in various ways. I like your kind of slide, as opposed to abandon, and then came back into a quasi mainline tradition, and now are, have really found life, energy, a calling. What's that all about? I mean, I know you can only speak to yourself ultimately, but I mean, have you seen that theme elsewhere? I have. I've seen it, in a number of different places.
Yeah, and I think we have people like that in both churches. I pastor a new church that I co-founded with my friend and colleague Vince Amlin, and then we also pastor an established congregation, 125-year-old congregation. And we have people like that in both churches, so I definitely see it. Speaking for my own, as you said, just for my own experience, the way I talk about why I'm still a Christian is that for me, the stories of Jesus and the questions around who Jesus was and what that shows us about God and all of those things, that the central stories and questions and practices of the Christian tradition, they're the ones that still do like all the heavy lifting for me. They carry water for me. And whether that's because I was simply exposed to them early. I mean, I have a friend who's the United Methodist pastor, and he was like, I mean, shocker. I grew up in North Carolina, the son of United Methodist, and I found meaning in the United Methodist Church as an adult. Like, so I do think that there's something that's like early exposure or whatever. And for me, I find beauty and meaning in a lot of places, but the things that I keep coming back to, the things that carry water, are the stories about Jesus and what his life shows us about who God is. So I don't know. I mean, I suspect that there's some of that for some other people as well.
Yeah. So it's the stories of Jesus, and how and you heard those when you were young, and now you're retelling them.
Yeah. I mean, they're the ones that are kind of written on my imagination and shaped my imagination.
So let's kind of shift there and talk a little bit about storytelling, because you were with us in New England in November at a convocation doing some teaching around storytelling, its value in our work in the church and how to do it well. And which, by the way, I thought was really very helpful and very well done and was really well received. And it, we've got things like the Moth Story Hour, and I mean, my gosh, there's how many podcasts and NPR kinds of things and so forth. Are Americans rediscovering storytelling? Is the American church rediscovering storytelling because it decided it wanted to get into doctrine for a long time, or what's going on with this?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's definitely. It feels like storytelling is culturally having a moment, and there are lots of people both in the church and out of the church who would say, well, it's not a new thing. I mean, when I first started doing storytelling, I mention this less because I think about it less, but I used to think of storytellers as like the awesome aging hippie who came to my elementary school and like brought her rain stick. You know what I mean? And it was this sort of folk and fable storytelling. And there is a robust practice of that in the United States. I think probably especially in the South. So there's some people who are kind of like miffed that they're like, it's not new. We've been doing storytelling all this time, my whole lifetime or whatever. And I think in the church, people would say, well, yeah, we're a people of the book. We're a people of, obviously Jesus told stories. It's not new. But that aspect of storytelling wherein it's not new for anyone, there's that book that calls human beings the storytelling animal. Like the fact that it's sort of there are theories that say this is how we carry and convey knowledge. It's not new. But the fact that it's sort of culturally having this moment, like The Moth and all of these storytelling podcasts and radio shows, it does feel like something that the church ought to do and maybe do better than we do, or do in additional ways to how we've done it. Because as I think I've said in your hearing at the convocation, going to these storytelling things, there are story events almost every night of the month in Chicago, and things are sold out. They're standing room only. People will stand in line to get into something like The Moth, and they'll like stand uncomfortably holding their jacket and their drink all night to hear people tell true stories in a live space. And the like lowercase e evangelical part of me is like, don't we have a true story that we believe in telling in community? And if we think that it's such great good news, going back to like good news that feels like good news, if we think it is a salvific story, then why are we mad that other people aren't coming to hear the story? Like, it feels like it's incumbent on us to tell what we think is a great story in a great way. And I don't think all those people who go to The Moth or all that, I don't think all those people are like one good story away from converting or anything. I'm not saying that at all, but it seems like there's just such an energy around it right now. And we have not only the stories of Jesus, but the practice of testimony and all that. So,
what is it about a story, whether it's in a sermon or in a testimonial kind of thing, or a mission temple talk or a mission moment that somebody would describe in a church setting? What is it about a story that grabs people in a way that other things don't?
So I this is my understanding of how some kinds of stories work, caveat. I think that both preachers and other public speakers, or radio hosts, podcast hosts, or whatever, we can fall into the trap of saying something like, you know how it is when X happens and you feel Y? You know how human beings are when this kind of thing happens, they feel this way? We can generalize in this way that is meant to be universalizing. Like, you can access this because you know how it is when such and such happens, you feel such and such a way. As a listener, when someone does that to me, if I haven't had that experience, I'm like, well, when I feel X, I don't exactly feel Y. Like, I don't, it creates this distance for me. Whereas when I, as a listener, hear someone say, when I experienced X, I felt Y, I think, oh, okay, probably you did. Like, why would you lie about that? Okay. And it sort of draws me in closer to the experience of another. And if the practice of testimony or preaching is about conveying the good news that I've experienced. So I had some encounter of God, whether I'm the Apostle Paul or me, I had some encounter with God, and I want to tell you about it. So I have this primary experience, and I'm going to try to convey the value of it to you. If that's the goal in like preaching and giving testimony, I want to bring you close to that experience. There's some kind of like David Tracy in here somewhere, but I can't remember the reference. But if I want to convey that primary experience, I think this is one of the ways to do it. I will simply tell you what happened to me as closely as I can. I'll put you in the place where I was when it happened. And rather than say, wouldn't you feel such and such if that happened to you? I'll just tell you what happened to me. And that, in my experience, in both church and non-church settings, it just brings me closer to your experience.
It's like the specific helps a number of different people enter into the general experience that you were trying to convey, or they'll interpret it in their own way.
And I think you can do in storytelling. The kind of storytelling that I'm most interested in is I don't want to make a lot of explicit meaning for the listeners. I don't want to do that. I love Ira Glass, but I'm not going to do the Ira Glass moment where I'm like, the thing I realized is that's when I understood that. It's fine. And sometimes I do it. And I definitely do it in preaching. But, Jesus rarely explained parables. Very rarely. I mean, are there two that he was explicit about? I mean, the parable of the sower for sure, and maybe there was another one. So he mostly just like gave them, and the fact, I think this is why the phrase that parables still carry waters. That we're like, well, what did it mean? Who am I in this story? Who is God supposed to be in this story? Is this even about God? Etc.
So Garrison Keillor once talked in an interview about his, and I know he's kind of fallen out of favor lately, but I still think that he had great value, as particularly in this area of storytelling. His critique of preaching that he had experienced, and maybe this was his own experience also growing up in a very traditional conservative denomination, is that it was trying to make points, was trying to convey information. And what Keillor was trying to do in his storytelling was take people someplace in their imagination, in time, and so forth and so on. That's always resonated with me, that there's something of great value when a well-told story allows you to go in your mind someplace. There's a certain mystical, spiritual quality to that kind of hearing the story and listening into that. And if preaching became, I think it did in the 20th century, too much expository proclamation, it erred too far on that side, and we left people without an experience, which then I think is part of what opened up in the United States an openness to kind of Pentecostalism and people really seeking a genuine experience of the divine.
I think when I grew up, my experience of sermons, and my dad's a good preacher, sermons were for like teaching. They were, he would say by his own, admission or description or whatever, that he was like a 3 points and a poem guy. He had an outline, he had a point to make. It was kind of an argument. I think that's what I think about storytelling. I'm not, especially when I'm just storytelling, like in public, not church public, but non-church public. I'm not making an argument. I'm just telling you a thing that happened. I'm not trying to prove anything to you. I'm just telling you what happened. I may have an underlying message that I'm trying to get across, but I'm not going to, set that up like that. So when I grew up, and I liked my dad's preaching, I liked church, but it was to like understand scripture. And I think that what I was looking for when I came back to church was something more akin to what I experienced in comedy, which was like an experience that points me in the direction more of like an ecstatic experience of God. Not that I haven't been part of Pentecostal or charismatic churches, but something that, like I said about comedy, that like creates that space. Like I don't want to just understand how God could make hope in my life. Like if I'm experiencing despair or depression, and I'm not talking hypothetically, like when I was experiencing depression and despair, like the thing I valued was like, like space to breathe. And some of that's learning style. You know, I want to have an experiential learning moment personally. And that's most often what I hope to do for other people, to, you know, revivify or vivify their imagination for scripture. Because I used to say, I love the book of Mark, but it didn't like jump off the page the first time I read it. You know, you've got to have some like imagination around the thing. So, you know, ellipsis. Got where I started, but that's some of the feeling about like my personal experience of how preaching, the role of preaching in my life has changed. I don't want just feeling. I want content, but I think it's possible to do both. I really do. I get a little bit of flack from people who've never heard me preach. Say, well, you just tell stories, right? Oh man. You want me to go 0 to 60 on you right now?
Right. Well, that is, and I was kind of going to ask you that question because I think there is that critique out from those folks who really value a teaching kind of component, is that, well, if you're just doing stories, and I know we're not talking either or, we're talking about supplementing, but there is that critique that it could fall into the area of relativism, and therefore then, you know, it's just, you're just doing feel good entertainment, but people aren't being moved in any particular, direction. Usually the critique comes from, you're not moving people intellectually to, intellectually assent to some kind of beliefs and understandings about Jesus and God and the faith.
Yeah, I'm non-creedal, so I don't give a rip about that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't assent to beliefs.
I know, but that's what's out there, that's not out there in the culture. But that is something that we have inherited, and for us in particular, in my tribe, that is an inheritance that is valued, and in some corners more than others.
So I do think that learning about scripture and the tradition is like it's something I value. I went to div school at the University of Chicago, and it was like the most exciting experience of my life. And other people found it like cold and heartless, and there was no spirit there. And I was like, well, you're wrong, like whatever. But I love. I'm not an academic person, but I am an intellectual person, or whatever the way to say that is.
Yeah.
So I value that. But like when I kind of want to define just for ourselves, like when we want people to, or when you want people to learn something in a sermon or in an adult ed class or confirmation class, or what's the content of what we want them to learn? Aside from what other people, like aside from the rubric that says we want people to understand aspects of the faith so they can assent to them, what does someone like you want a person to learn in a church service or in an adult ed class?
Well, for me personally, I'm less bound to that, traditional, we need to learn the catechism kind of content. But I'll speak for that voice in the church and in my tribe to say that, intellectually understanding some different aspects of the Christian faith, of the creed, of the history of it, of the doctrine of how we understand the Christian faith is important, because being a learned person is part of what informs you as a disciple of Jesus. I think that that's how it would probably be framed.
I mean, I ask in part because it's a question I have for myself. Like, I definitely want people to learn something. I don't think I should quote him, but Sunday night, my co-pastor preached this sermon that was both like bawdy and hilarious, and talked about the controversy in the early church between the Docetists and he just threw down this like early church history in this way that he sort of made fun of in the sermon. But it's like I think this is
Well, so that's an example. I mean, and probably I don't know, I wasn't there. He's weaving in stories to try to help and communicate that. So there's some substance, some content and so forth in that whole exchange.
The goal for me of storytelling in preaching, or I don't do just storytelling. I wouldn't tell like a story and just leave it as a sermon. I don't, that's not how I preach. But for me, the goal of storytelling in preaching is that the story would do as much heavy lifting as possible, that it would be, that the story would be, think of like architecturally, like a load bearing structure. So that it, whether it mirrors the focus of whether it mirrors the function of the scriptural text or whether it sheds light on the scriptural text in some way, I am deeply opposed to like stories as like a warm-up act or like an intro or a joke. No, some people might experience a given sermon that way. It's out of my control at a certain point, but it's to serve the function of the text. So it actually takes a ton of work. I mean, I'm trying to like.
Oh yeah. To do this well, this is not. I think that's the other piece that is an unfair critique. Is we're just kind of throwing a story that's pretty easy to do, not a well-told story.
Right.
And there's a difference between sitting around at Thanksgiving dinner, just kind of, throwing out stories about what happened to you last month or last year and putting something together that you're trying to convey to a gathered people around word and table.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I've said is that if the relationship between the teller and the listener is a close one, there's less burden on the content. If you and I are old friends, and I might have said this example when we were together in New England, but if you and I are old friends and I say, how was your day? And you say, it was fine. I tried to buy a pair of pants and I couldn't find a pair I liked. That is a sufficient story because our relationship undergirds the story. And because I already care about you, apparently you want pants and I want you to have pants if you want them. Like that's sufficient. But it's not yet a story.
Not ready for prime time.
Yeah, like what's at stake in the story, And I think there's plenty at stake in trying to buy a pair of pants. Actually, I think quite small stories can have big stakes, but the stories you tell at the Thanksgiving table or whatever, there's some relationship that undergirds those, and people are just interested because you're you, and they want to, So those aren't the kind of stories that if I'm doing my job, those aren't the kind of stories I'm telling in sermons.
So what kind of advice would you give to people, both preachers and people in congregations that are going to be asked? Because one of the things I think I'd love to see a recovery of in mainline Protestantism is a version of testimonials. Now we've heard I've been in enough, I went to Fuller Seminary, so I've heard enough of the kind of canned, it's really a 3-point story, and it's the same story, and everybody tells it, and it's a version of the prodigal son. But I don't think we're talking about that.
Right.
But what's some advice you would give to people that, I'm going to tell my faith story in, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that, or an aspect of it. What advice would you give?
So the new congregation that we pastor is a storytelling church. A couple of people tell stories every week, and those are stories that they've prepared. And the style we do it in, so this is the one I'm most familiar with. The way we approach it is not to ask for the big picture, not the sweeping whole story like a 12-step lead. This is what it was like. This is what happened. This is what it's like now. Not a whole faith story. I once was lost and now I'm found. The end, it's like you said, the sort of 3-part story. But to ask a more specific question that's tied to the theme for that day, which is built on the text for that day, and to say, so. Let me give a specific. The kinds of things we ask people, we'll give people a theme for like a whole month. So this month of January, our theme has been origin stories, meaning both ours as a congregation, ours as the church universal, and then individual people stories, which it's actually a very broad ask, like how'd you end up like this? but then to talk about one specific aspect of that. So one week somebody told a story.
So specific, I heard that.
Yeah. So, and to think of, for my money, this kind of storytelling, like this genre that I work with, it's built out of scenes, like moments in time where you're telling us what happened, not like what it was about, you know. So instead of panning back and saying, I've always been a very angry person, you're telling, you put yourself in the moment and say, you know, ever since I was a little kid and I blew up when such and such happened, I've had a bad temper. And you sort of let me see what it was like as you moved around the world with a bad temper. And so it's specific. Like you can, I think there's an impulse in church for sure. I think it's the thing that is beneath that impulse to say when X happens, you feel Y. I mean, there's this urge to make it universal, but I'm far from the first person to say it's in the specifics. So we have this urge to like, I want you to know the whole story about how God saved my life. Okay, make it as specific as you can. Like, tell me one, like, what did it look like? What did it feel like for you? What happened? And for people to tell as much of the story as they can, like in the moments when it happened. Like, don't tell us from the safety of now that you one time got kidnapped and you made it out. Put us in the back seat of the car when you realize these guys were not going to drop you off where they said they were. Like, we see you made it out. You're in front of us telling the story, but I want to like go around the curves on Route 2 out of Boston with you, you know, like, so.
So I'm also hearing in that being in the moment, don't give away the ending too soon. Like, let us be in that vehicle for a while going around those bends. So there's a certain tension and suspense that builds.
Yeah, I think so. And to let us know what was at stake for you in the moment. Like, even if it's very different now. I mean, you think about it, it's almost like treating yourself the way we hopefully treat little kids, which is like to recognize like the thing that you, 4-year-old, think is so terrible. Like, I know it's not, but your feelings are real. It's like treating your own story like that. Like in the moment, I was terrified and I didn't yet know that, whatever, I didn't know the outcome, or I didn't know that actually I wasn't in danger, or, so treating the feelings of it as sort of real and as part of the story. Like bring us.
And then when you get to the ending of the story, what's one or two do's and do nots around that?
You said for making the story?
For ending, when you're concluding, when you're getting to the end of you've told your story, you're going around the curves and you're coming towards the end of your story. What's a good way to do that? What's a way not to do that ending?
Well, try to end it only once. Don't end it a bunch of times. Just pick one. You can do a different one next time. So end it once. End it with, this is really hard. The end of your story. What's the way to say this? Sometimes people come up with great endings, but they're the endings to a different story. And Jesus actually does it in the parable of the maidens and the lamps. You know, because that 5 have oil, 5 don't. And they all fall asleep, and bridegroom, you know, that one. And at the end, so it's like a perfect example of someone giving a good end line that's the end to a different story. At the end, Jesus is like, therefore, stay awake. And you're like, literally everyone fell asleep. Like, what are you talking about? Like, the end is like, therefore, be prepared. Therefore, you know, like the song "Keep Your Lamps Trimmed and Burning." That's the end of the story.
Right.
That's the story. So it's great. So what's your story about so far? It's about preparedness. It's about not asking other people. You know, in the case of the maidens, like it's not asking other people to do the work that you should have done. You know, which is the way I preached it most recently. Like, what does this story feel like it's about?
And kind of a singularity of focus, too.
Yeah. Which allows you to make, I mean, this isn't about the ending, but a focus allows you to make edits as you go. Like, the thing about the dog, it's really great, but it doesn't like move this story along, especially if I only have 3 minutes to tell it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Interesting. Good stuff. Yeah. I'd love to see our congregations have people embrace what you're doing and what others are doing. Molly Feeney Basquette did that, I think, in Somerville. I suspect she's doing it out in Berkeley now, where, we're having people in the congregation tell their stories, because I think that really comes to life in a lot of ways. And this is a strange thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. Mm-hmm. One of the best storytelling experiences I ever had was attending AA meetings. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously those are not for public consumption, unless you're in the meeting, and there's the anonymity aspect, but that's powerful stuff. Not a lot of them, but a lot of them are really powerful.
And what's at stake is really, really clear.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And people have a shared, our part of our tagline at the new church is true stories that save lives. And talk about true stories that save lives. Those are in 12-step rooms.
Yeah. So let's kind of wrap up with this church that you're pastoring now. Tell me a little bit about it and what it is. And do you just sit around and tell stories all day long?
No, if anything, some people come and are surprised by how liturgical it is if they have, depending on where they're coming from.
So it's in Chicago.
Yeah. So this is a church in Chicago. It's called Gilead Chicago, which we named right before Hulu re-released a version of The Handmaid's Tale. So of course, Gilead is the name of the misogynist fascist dictatorship. So that's great. And so our people are hashtag our church, not that Gilead. So Gilead, we just celebrated 2 years. We meet on the far north side of Chicago. Right now we meet right up against Evanston. And we call it these days a queer storytelling bar church. Although we don't meet in a bar these days. So we meet on Sunday evenings. These days we sing pretty much exclusively pop music, because we found that is what that was sort of the congregational voice that we discovered. And we sing, we choose that music the way that anyone chooses music for their liturgy, which is thinking about the theme and thinking about ways that the music can sort of further illuminate the theme or the text or whatever. And it's surprisingly effective in that regard. We have communion weekly, and we have a couple of storytellers who tell on a theme. And I think people who haven't been, think that the thing is the bar part. You're a bar church, but the thing, for people who do come, the thing is the stories. So we have these two storytellers, usually, and every story that gets told, we affirm it as the Word of God. So we also have scripture, of course. It's we tell it /read it embedded in the sermon. But after each story, we say, this is the Word of God for the people of God, and the congregation says, thanks be to God. The claim being, that if God is still at move in the world, which we think God is, that one of the ways that is true in and through us. So, and the other way that story happens is that at the beginning of the service, we hand out, this is something that people could do immediately. Everyone could start this in their congregation this week. We hand out little slips of paper with the beginning of a sentence. So a week on life-saving stories, the sentence would be, my life got saved when. You try to end with the word when, because it drives people to a particular moment. This past Sunday we did, I sang my heart out when. And you give people just a little piece of paper so they can only write a little bit, and we read them as part of the welcome. And
oh, cool.
Yeah, my regional minister out here, I'm Disciples, my regional minister casually in some group conversation said, well, they work as the call to worship. And I was like, is that the call? We have a call to worship. So you hear this cloud of witnesses. You hear this, you hear all the voices of the people in the room. They're anonymous, and people can opt in for the level of seriousness. So my life got saved can be about a time when they had a failed suicide attempt, or it could be I was so hungry after school and my mom brought me a snack. People, and you just hear everybody in the room, not everyone, but you hear lots of who's in the room. And yeah, it's
I like it.
I highly recommend that practice, even if you do it only occasionally or for a season or whatever. It just, yeah, I
And the
recommend.
prompting, I think the prompting is really key.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
It's
great.
reading sideways, right? You try to think about what is this about. We always come up with this long list of possible prompts, most of which are unprintable, even for us. Half of which are meant as like absurd jokes, and
Right.
then eventually we hit on one. And
Yeah.
so,
Nice. And so the church is what's your website?
GileadChicago.org.
Okay. And you also have a storytelling I don't know exactly what, work, calling, training program, whatever it is.
I travel around and help other people. You say you've got stories, we help you tell them. I do workshops or occasionally keynotes, as you experienced. I help people put on shows of their own storytellers. I call it my Judy Garland business model. Let's put on a show. So I travel a little bit and do some of that work. And there's um, you can people can find out more about that at earshotstories.com,
Okay.
which is mostly a giant static business card of a website. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm there and people can track me
Right.
down. Doing so.
Well, I think your work, your ministry is really exciting, really interesting, and I wish you well with it. I'm so glad that we got a chance to talk a little bit.
Me too. I'm so glad to have met you and to come out to New England and to be part of this as well.